Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Aziz Animan, I welcome you all to another episode of the Great Power Rivalry, and I am here today with the one and only, the war correspondent, Theo Mullis, and Theo Altrop Mullis, TA Mullis is joining us. Welcome to you to our show once again, and I believe this is the first time you're appearing on this format, the Great Power Rivalry. Welcome anyway. How are you?
Thank you very much indeed for having me on, Mr. Raja. It's wonderful to be here, and I am doing well.
Well, that's really great. So, ladies and gentlemen, Theo Altrop Mullis, TM Mullis, is a former police officer. For those of you who don't know him, as a former Metropolitan Police officer turned journalist, much like me, a Pakistani military man turned journalist. He is a lawman turned journalist. And he's a war correspondent. For those of you who don't know, he is covering the Ukraine war from on ground in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and Europe. And right now he's in London, and we are lucky to have him today, and we are lucky to get his perspective about things, because whatsoever he tells us, it's a first-hand knowledge, unadulterated knowledge, uncensored, information, and that's the way we like it. And I think, Theo, you are the first freelance war correspondent whom I know. Actually, there must be many more, but whom I know, I'm saying. Do you know anyone else like you who's been covering the war in Ukraine as a freelance journalist?
Oh yeah, there's a fair few. Top of my head, I can think of Paul Conroy. There's Tom Mulch, Jimmy Rushton. There's a good number out there doing this on a freelance basis. Most of them base all of their time in Kyiv. I bounce between London, Europe, and Ukraine.
So, Theo, in last 1 week, a lot has been happening regarding
Yeah.
Ukraine war, and regarding the great power rivalry, regarding the new Cold War, actually, between the Red Dragon and between the Great Bear, or the Bear Trap, and between the Eagle or Falcon. I mean, it's American Eagle. I know, the bald eagle. So between the United States, Russia, and China, everybody, the Great Power Rivalry, or the new Cold War, is at play in Ukraine right now. Ukraine is the center stage of this Great Power Rivalry. So, please, can you update us about this Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska, followed by President Trump's meeting with the European leaders, which was attended by the Ukrainian president as well, and the head of NATO was there, and of course the key leaders from the European Union were there, and the United Kingdom was there. What is the analysis, and what are the news, and what is your take on what's happening up till now regarding this table talks which we are seeing regarding the Ukraine war? And of course it is related to the great power rivalry, but talk
Absolutely is.
about this particular topic. What is your feedback? What is your reporting about that? What have you learned so far? Over to you, Theo, please.
Watching President Trump, watching where he stands on Ukraine, on Russia, it's it's exhausting. It's kind of it's a real roller coaster ride. Yeah, to put an analogy, watching him go from supporting Ukraine to supporting Putin, it's like watching a batsman in a game of cricket. He's just running between the wickets, going back and forth, and you don't really know where he's going to be at any moment. So, when he went to Alaska to meet Putin, it was a pretty dark moment for myself. I mean, I sit firmly on the side of anti-imperialism and the Ukraine war is an example of imperialism. So watching Trump meet, smile, shake hands with President Putin, literally rolling out the red carpet for him, and then coming out of that meeting and saying, well, Ukraine's going to have to cede territory, and it's really significant territory as well, There's no chance of Ukraine joining NATO. And other Russian demands, which include the full recognition of the Russian language, which is a bit of an odd one because plenty of people in Ukraine speak Russian and
Yeah.
Ukrainian, and recognition and unofficial status to the Russian Orthodox Church, which is an interesting one because there is freedom of religion in Ukraine. Of course, we've discussed this previously. However, the Russian Orthodox Church is an arm of the Russian state. Its patriarch, the head of the church, Patriarch Kirill, is a former member of the KGB and a close personal friend of Vladimir Putin. And a number of priests have been indicted for spying on behalf of the Russians. So it's almost like saying, you will allow our spies into your country. But of course, there are priests of the Russian Patriarchy which don't do this. So it's a difficult balance, but including it in these negotiations in a country which it practices freedom of religion is odd. And I think it reveals more about what they want. And these goals are maximalist. They haven't drawn back on anything that they have said in previous negotiations. Bear in mind that the territory they want to take, two oblasts or regions, provinces of Ukraine, called Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, they control most of Luhansk already, the Russians, and they control about 2/3 of Donetsk. But what's key is that the Ukrainians, about 40 kilometers-ish, maybe more, maybe less, behind the current line of contact, what they call in Soviet parlance, Eastern European military terms, the zero line.
Could you please speak up a bit, because that was a complaint in
Oh,
our.
sure.
Yeah, please.
I apologize. They've built really significant military fortifications along this line. And under what the Russians want, they'd own all of that. And not only that, but the Ukrainians would be forced to give up territory that the Russians have failed in 3 years of the largest war we've seen on European soil since World War II to take militarily. And Trump echoed this, and Trump said, oh, you may have to give up some territory. And the Russians said, oh, well, we'll give you back some land in Kharkiv Oblast, which is to the north, and Sumy Oblast, which is also to the north, which is a significant amount less than what they're demanding from the Ukrainians, and significantly less important. So it was pretty dark seeing Trump come out of that, given all of his bluster about I'm going to increase secondary sanctions. They've got 50 days. No, wait, no, they don't. That last raid was terrible. They've got 10 days. Then that day came and went, as previous have done before, with nothing happening at all. He almost pretends that he doesn't know what he said before. So now it caused panic in Europe amongst the other European states, the European allies, or the so-called coalition of the willing. And they all went with Zelensky to DC, where they met yesterday. And again, the batsman went to the other wicket. The tone was completely different. Now, the president is saying that the United States will back up any security guarantees in the future, which has always been what the Ukrainians have been pushing for, is firm security guarantees, and has always been what the Europeans, in an amount of spinelessness, have been calling for. We will provide security guarantees, but only if the Americans do so as well. And it's completely exhausting to keep track of. I actually think we have one person to thank whenever Trump becomes more supportive of Ukraine, and that is his wife, Melania, who wrote a letter to President Putin imploring him to think of the children of Ukraine who he's bombed repeatedly. A whole family was killed in Kharkiv Oblast the other night, including their two children. I think one of which was about 9 months ish old, by a Russian Iranian designed drone slammed into their apartment building. And whenever Melania brings this up, Trump's position shifts. But then he speaks to Putin and it shifts again. Or he speaks to Witless Witkoff, his negotiator in chief, who will go down as one of the worst diplomats in human history. And he went to Moscow. He doesn't speak a word of Russian. And he didn't bring a translator with him. So he relied on the translators that the Kremlin gave him. Which is, I mean, think about that. It's they could be telling him anything. It's
So,
just diplomacy 101.
Theo, if I'm getting this right, what you're saying is that the European leadership and the Ukrainian leadership is not inclusive in this process of negotiations between President Trump and President Putin. But President Trump is definitely giving an impression that the Europeans are inclusive in this process. I mean, he made them sit on this table and he gave them 2 minutes each to introduce themselves. And he was like the head teacher sitting on the table, like the headmaster. And he was telling, all right, 2 minutes for you, 2 minutes for you, go on. And they all were very obedient children, very obedient class there. So the impression you're giving is that the European leaders are not inclusive in this process. Is that your take?
And this is my point when he's like a batsman in cricket running between the wickets. In Alaska, there was no talk of the Europeans. They were not included at all. But then the Europeans all called Trump, and then suddenly they're included again, and he runs to the other wicket.
In all fairness, Theo, in all fairness, Theo, isn't this what a negotiator is supposed to do, or somebody who's a deal maker is supposed to do? That he's supposed to mediate. So is he not a mediator in between the Europeans and the Russians? Or do you think there's something else going on? Because I'm leading you to my next question, and I've got a theory coming from the U.S. itself, and I'll present it to you. But I want to hear you out first, please.
If he is attempting to act a mediator, he's doing it in a very strange way. But everything Trump does on the international stage is done in a very strange way. And there has been significant progress. We are probably closer to a ceasefire deal. I hesitate to call it a peace deal because I think this war is going to go the way of Korea, than we have been before. And his ability because he's the president of the United States, when Vladimir Putin landed in Alaska, he was met by rows of F-22 and F-35 jets. 2 F-35 jets and a B-2 bomber flew overhead. And if that's not a message, then I don't know what is. Russia, you can't do these things. And we can have B-2s over Moscow and you wouldn't even know about it.
And there was a leakage as well in which President Trump asked President Zelensky that, listen, can you bomb Moscow? And he said, if you give us the weapons, we can do it, of course. And publicly, President Trump is saying, no, nobody should bomb Moscow. But privately, there are messages are being floated and the information has been leaked to the media. I suppose the Financial Times leaked the story, but correct me if I'm wrong. So what is that? What is going on over there?
I wish I was able to give you a solid answer there. I don't think, and this is something that Anne Applebaum says, she's a very significant figure in international relations theory in Europe, is an American. She's married to the Polish foreign minister, but Trump has no strategic theory, right? And he wants to be seen as a deal maker. He wants this war to end because it'd be an enormous win for him at home in the States. He can say, I've stopped another war. It's a distraction from certain scandals that he may be involved with, or may have been involved with, in terms of the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. So it's taking heat off of that. And the can you bomb Moscow? That was a question that was asked. The Ukrainians, they do have drones which have the capability to reach Moscow, and they have before, and they've reached much further into Russia with Operation Spiderweb, where they hired Russians to drive trucks filled with FPV drones that attacked Russian air bases. They've also just unveiled a missile with a 3,000-kilometer range. They're calling it the Flamingo, named after a big pink bird. The Ukrainians can't name things, but okay. And with that, they can strike deep, deep inside Russia. And this is something that that we've seen for some time. The Ukrainians relying less and less on the technological aid from Europe and the United States, and doing things themselves. I mean, this is a drone war, and Ukraine manufactures up to 80% of its own drones. It has the capacity to fight this, and we've seen the Russian limited breakthrough near Pokrovsk has now been cut up and pushed back, and that got a lot of news. People saying, "Oh, the line is falling. There's going to be a rout." Nothing of the sort happened.
All right, so Theo, let me present you a realpolitik point of view from Washington, D.C. Yesterday, I was having this very interesting podcast with Matt O'Brien. I don't know whether you know Matt O'Brien or not. He's based in Bristol. He's basically a Kiwi musician turned activist for Julian Assange, and now he's a journalist as well, a citizen journalist. But I presented him this realpolitik theory, which came to me during an Urdu language program with military officer, a colonel. His name is Syed Akbar Hussain. Colonel Syed Akbar Hussain, while talking to me, presented this theory from Washington, D.C. He said, "Listen, mate, the future of the energy corridor." Now, this is going to sound very callous to a lot of people here, but here's a map. Have a look at the map, and you see, if you look at the world map, what the future energy or resources lie in the Pacific. Do we agree?
Enormous numbers, yeah.
Yeah. And with the global warming, there are a lot of opportunity which are arising, and ice is melting, and there are new resources, mineral resources to be exploited, to be extracted, to be explored, whatever politically correct word do you want to use over here. But if you look at the Pacific, and if you look at the map, it is the United States of America and Russia which controls the Pacific, in fact. So they're trying to make a deal. They're trying to bypass Europe, which is nowhere around Pacific. If you look at the map, they're right there in the center. So they can be easily bypassed, overlooked, and the Russians and the Americans can make a deal amongst themselves to explore the resources of the Pacific, and they don't really have to listen to the Europeans. So that is why President Trump is schooling the European leadership into making a deal which, as per you, does not, really go in favor of the Ukrainian point of view or the European positions or European interests, but they're bound to listen to the headmaster, as we say. So what do you think that this theory coming out of Washington, D.C., and it looks it makes a lot of sense when you look at the global map, and well, the Europe is right there in the center. They've got no interest there, but the Americans and the Russians are controlling the resources in Pacific, and they can only work there together, and they can only, distribute it amongst themselves if the war in Ukraine is resolved, and America gets the critical mineral deal, which they've already got, in fact, and the Russians get the land which they seek, and then they distribute the rest of. They're free to go on and distribute resources in Pacific. What do you say to that? What do you think about that?
I think it's like making a deal with a man who's got 10 days to live. I don't think
Really?
that the Russians are going to have much say in what happens in Eastern Russia anymore. Russia's economy is an absolute mess. They are on they are on a complete war footing. Um, Inflation, the national debt is growing at a really incredible rate. Um, and where economies are growing in Russia in small areas, we're seeing the growth of the war pension economy. So people get married. The guy goes off to fight in the special military operation in the war, the illegal invasion of Ukraine. They get an enormous sign-on bonus, a life-changing amount of money, um, especially for a Russian, but it would be a huge lump of cash anywhere else in the world. He dies, right? She gets more cash, perhaps marries somebody new, the same cycle starts again. These towns are being emptied of young men, and especially the areas of Russia you're pointing to. What's a major city? Vladivostok out there. That's not the imperial center. The person or the state you want to look at, and the Americans will want to probably try to mitigate against, is not Russia there, it's China. And China can effectively control Eastern Russia as it stands at the moment. The Russians are becoming a client state of the Chinese. So why make a deal with Russia? Why not make a deal with Xi Jinping? Or better, considering the rearmament of Japan and South Korea, make a deal with them. Reform SEATO.
All right, that's interesting. You should tell the people it's you're talking about Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. You want to reform that. All right, that's looks very good
Well,
on paper. Here looks very good on paper. But on ground, what's happening is that President Trump has antagonized the Indians, and they are now the Chinese foreign ministers there, and the Indian Prime Minister Modi is going to Beijing the next week. And they're saying that we are now partners with our rivals. That there goes the policy of last 3 decades of strategic policy of the U.S.-led West, and make trying to make India the counterweight to China. There it goes for the sixth. Pakistan is a nuclear power, but President Trump had a lunch with the military dictator from Pakistan, and he's supporting the military dictatorship over there, which does not enjoy the public mandate. There will be no political stability. American soft power is going to get damaged like anything in that particular aspect. And now what you are saying looks very good on paper, but what's happening on ground is that, all right, fine, you're saying that the Russians are only waiting there to, for the great power rivalry between the US and Chinese to, explode maybe. And they're also waiting to exploit the spoils out of that particular war, the Cold War, the new Cold War between China and the US. All right. So what you're saying does sound good, but the ground situation right now is happening exactly opposite. President Trump, he wants to. He might be, looking to get the Nobel Peace Prize out of this deal. But what's the geostrategical play right now in the world? The way we see it, it's really not going in the favor of the U.S.-led Western camp, but it is going in the favor of the U.S. at least. So U.S. is, right now, before the Second World War, the U.S. had to be convinced to come into the Second World War. And thanks to the Japanese,
the Japanese,
who bombed Pearl Harbor, they came in. Otherwise, the Europeans had it. It was game over for them. Let's be honest about it. So even right now, they are, they're not getting the fair end of the deal or the stick, whatever you may like to call it. So how do you think all this global power rivalry is playing out? What you're saying, And if you look at the developments on ground, they're an opposing tangent. Don't you think so?
I think so. What I'm saying is what I'd prefer. What we're seeing is a U.S. president who doesn't understand soft power really, and the only thing, I mean, he really messed up dealing with the Indians, uh, saying, "Oh, only using the stick. We want them to stop buying oil off of the Russians." Okay, well, the United States is one of the world's largest oil producers and has enormous stockpiles of the stuff. So sell to the Indians at and sell to the Indians matching the price. If
Yeah,
that's what you want to do,
yeah,
if you want to if your strategic goal is to undercut the Russians, take a short-term hit and undercut the Russians, because the Indians will happily buy oil at 5 cents less on the barrel if you sell it to them. They don't care where it comes from.
yeah. That's true.
And but this is Trump's weakness, is that the man cannot abide being seen as weak. If he were to do that, then he would fear, and fear is a lot of what drives him, that people would say, "Oh, well, you're giving in to the Indians' demands and you're being soft. You're a hard man. Act like a hard man." And that's the issue. The United States is being led by a man who thinks primarily of ratings and of his personal perception. He isn't thinking in the medium and especially not the long term. He's thinking about, how do I look in the New York Post, which is his favorite newspaper, reads it every day, tomorrow? And what accolades will I get? And this is the struggle that the Europeans are having at the moment, because they are trying to think in the medium and long term for the security of the European continent, but also for the security of the world, and the idea that securing the idea that large nations cannot simply invade small nations, take a couple provinces and call it a day. That's
Yeah.
19th century.
Yeah, all right. I agree with you over there. But we are talking realpolitik. And in realpolitik, I've presented you a point of view from Washington, D.C., and you haven't been able to answer that so far. You've presented a counter theory and a suggestion for the European leader and for the American leadership. But what's happening on ground is that if Russians and if President Trump and Putin wants to make a deal, and they've been trying to make that deal, let's be fair and square about it, all right? If you have a look at what was going on and what's happening right now, in the above picture you can see President Trump and Putin in 2018, and now they're continuing from where they left in 2025. So, all right, you've got a good idea for the Europeans maybe, but he's not listening to the Europeans. He wants to deal with Putin directly. It leaves the European leadership in a lurch. So where does that leave Europe? The way I've presented your point of view, and it does make a lot of sense on paper as well, and you agree that they want to distribute the resources of the Pacific amongst themselves. All right, they're not going to share it with the Chinese, who are their competitors, right? And there's a lot in common between the Russians and the Americans, like the picture is seen, than the Chinese and the Americans. And at the end of the day, it is about national interest. It is not about, there are no friendships in the international relations. There are only national interests. And if it is in the Russian national interest to ditch the Chinese, they will ditch the Chinese. But at the same time, they are, part of the BRICS alliance, which is a financial alliance to counter the Western hegemony. The Western hegemony cannot be countered at the time the American financial hegemony is there. And the American financial hegemony is based on, the control of resources. And so is the Chinese hegemony. But the Chinese control 80% of the critical minerals of the world. So the Americans are going after the critical mineral control now. That is why they've made the deal with in Ukraine. They're going to. They're also making a deal with Pakistan. They want a regime change in Afghanistan for the same purpose, because that is where the future, that is where the critical mineral reserves are, and that is where the Chinese are well entrenched. So they're going to have a global power rivalry. They're already having that with the Chinese. The Russians are not involved in that particular sector, so it's easier to make a deal with the Russians. And there is a history between President Putin and President Trump,
There certainly
as
is a
the picture.
history there.
Where does that leave the Europeans, Theo?
Well, the Europeans have to realize that the times of softness are over, and the times of the post Cold War Francis Fukuyama end of history, post international relations stuff is done, and it's time to arm up, have a cohesive, unified foreign policy, a cohesive, unified military. And I think what we're going to see from the Europeans, barring some probably nationalist spasms, is a move towards a closer union, and that will be a more unified foreign policy, and as has been floated repeatedly and has a lot more traction now, a united European defense. That's the only way. And Europe is, if you combine all of the economies of Europe, they are an inch smaller than the United States. And that's only recently that's happened.
Yeah, and the President Trump has been boasting about the trade deal he's made with Europe.
Yeah.
So he says it's the biggest trade deal in the history of the world, which is true, actually. But having said that, don't you find the Chinese taking over the space being left behind by such callous policies of the American administration?
Yeah. I mean, wherever the United States leaves or fails, the Chinese will try to move in, and the Chinese will behave in ways very similar, if not slightly worse, than the United States. And what they don't bring, and this is the short-term advantage that they have over powers like the United States and Europe, more Europe than the United States these days, they don't bring any of the good governance demands, quote unquote good governance demands, pro-democracy stuff that the Europeans try to push whenever they get involved, or at least they try to outwardly push. There's a lot of dealings done under the table, but a lot of what we've spoken about realpolitik is the reason, is among the reasons why I don't believe that it accurately describes the state of the world, or at least in realist international theory. I think we need to look more towards perceptions. So
yeah, perceptions are much more important than reality, isn't it?
Yeah. So Britain, under realpolitik, Britain is a much larger threat to the United States than North Korea, because Britain has Vanguard class submarines, 400 nuclear warheads. If you're just talking about hard power,
Britain is the bigger threat to the United States or Russia?
Or Russia would be if you're just talking about hard power. But
yeah.
I'm comparing it to North Korea. So if you compare Britain or Iran, say, as a threat to the United States under realpolitik or realist international theory, Britain should be seen as the larger threat, but it's not, because there are perceptions involved. There is more unified culture. There's a history of alliance. There's a shared language, all of this sort of stuff, which is important. And that's what underpins quite a lot of why I do not believe that the Russians, the Chinese, etc., will succeed in the long term, because there is more underpinning the alliances in Europe and the alliances between, not under a Trump White House, sure, but that's only got another 3 years left in it. It's something that can be fixed in time. However, there is more underpinning that alliance than self-interest.
So, Theo, do you see the United Kingdom making use of Brexit and in a way that they want to carve independent trade contracts and trade deals and foreign independent foreign policy. And do you think it's working out for the United Kingdom? And what do you think is the future role of United Kingdom? Or I understand your point of view, but I want you to tell the audience what do you think of it. Firstly, secondly, what do you think should be the future way forward for United Kingdom under the current circumstances which we have discussed, in which President Trump is looking to make a deal directly with Russia? All right, he's there for another 3 years. That's it. But still, and the relationship between the United Kingdom, Britain, and the United States is a historic one. It's not going anywhere. The connections of cousins would stay there. There are blood relations, let's say that, so that the Russians cannot, for the time being, whatsoever President Trump, the damage President Trump, the so-called damage he's doing, can be undone. All right, fine. But what do you think is the way forward for the United Kingdom under the circumstances? And do you think we are benefiting from Brexit or not?
So the United Kingdom is in a position now which it has not been at any point in its history. The United Kingdom, as it has been, united between England, Scotland, etc., Ireland, and Wales, has not stood alone at any point. Previous, it was an empire, colonies all around the world, and supported by imperialist expansion, with all of the crimes that comes with. When the empire fell, when the empire collapsed, Britain immediately joined the European project. And now Britain is out of the European project. Britain doesn't have an empire. Britain is, for the first time, a lonely island in the North Atlantic. And we're not doing very well. You only have to walk the streets of London to see how things have started to deteriorate. Go into a shop, you'll see prices are much higher than they were years ago, and the shelves are emptier than they were years ago. And there's a general sense of malaise and of a lack of perceived direction that the United Kingdom should take. People don't really know what this country is about anymore. And there's a lot of social friction. So what I want Britain to do and what is likely to happen are, of course, two different things. It's likely going to get a little bit grimmer in the United Kingdom economically, and social cohesion will continue to slowly, hang on, let me mute will continue to suffer as jobs are lost, as businesses move out, as growth stalls, because the UK moved away from its most significant trading partner,
The European Union.
the European Union, where we had frictionless trade. I could take, in fact, I know somebody who put a satellite, they're a rocket scientist, in the back of their car because it had to get to Europe within 10 hours, and they just drove it to Europe. No checks required, nothing like that. Now they have parking lots of trucks waiting to have all of their paperwork done. Vegetables, fruit rots in the fields because previously people would come over from Europe, work in the farms for the harvest period, then go home. And that isn't happening. And there aren't enough people in the United Kingdom who are willing to do this kind of work. Or say, okay, well then just someone's got to do the job. So if there's no work, they'll do that. The problem is they're still not doing it. They're finding work either remotely for companies abroad, or they're moving away.
Yeah.
And one thing, my old job, I was a police officer. I used to get targeted adverts on social media, because social media knows everything about you, from Australian police trying to recruit me to go work in West Australia. And the same thing happens with nurses and doctors and teachers. People are leaving now. And it's going to have to get a lot worse before Britain gets over its misplaced pride. Britain is no longer an empire. This is a good thing. Britain is still a rich country, but it is going to be overtaken. It's experiencing what we call relative economic decline. Growth is still happening, but other countries are growing faster. And we need to accept that, because if we accept it, then our economy can grow again and our children can have a better future without any of this baggage. And accepting that means accepting that we're a European country in Europe and rejoining the European project. Because
All right.
Europe,
So,
as we've seen from Trump, from the way he's treated Europe and the way Europe is seen on the world stage, is dithering, rich but weak, and a bit soft. And that is changing. I mean, try to say the Poles are dithering. Um, they have one of the largest and best equipped land armies in the world at the moment, and they've been building that up for years. And finally, we're seeing the other European nations realize that, oh, wait, the Americans might not always be there to protect us. Europe is a sleeping giant right now. It is drunk from the victory in the Cold War and finally waking up with a bit of a headache and realizing, oh no, wait, I made some
hangover,
mistakes. Yeah,
hangover, yeah.
yeah. It's the victory hangover from the Cold War. And
Yeah.
when Europe gets its act together and gets a unified defense policy, gets a unified foreign policy, and is, for all intents and purposes, on the international stage, a single actor, well, a bundle of sticks is much harder to break than one. And Europe will be a serious player. Won't be a player in the Pacific because, well, Europe's not in the Pacific, but certainly large enough to counter Russia, because Russia is surprisingly weak. When you look at what everybody thought would happen in Ukraine, I predicted a couple of months and then a bloody
Yeah.
protracted
Everybody was saying
insurgency.
that. Everybody was
Yeah.
saying that. And mind you, the Ukrainians don't have the modern weaponry the Russians have or the Americans have. They've been given vintage equipment by the
Yeah.
Americans. And it is so vintage that the ammunition has to be sourced from around the world, from countries like Pakistan. Even Chinese are selling ammunition to rebranded by Made in Pakistan, maybe, and coming from the UK, going into Ukraine. So they're using vintage ammunition and vintage weapons, and yet they're fighting the Russian, the Great Bear. All right, and they haven't, and credit must be given to the Ukrainians for standing up to
Absolutely.
tyranny. Yeah,
The
you find
Ukrainians have
all
fought
sort of
like
mercenaries
lions.
against them. You're fighting all sort of mercenaries against them. The Chinese are fighting against them. You'll find the Pakistanis, the Indians, the North Koreans, mercenaries.
Mhm.
Even the regular armies are fighting there. But the Ukrainians are standing firm there, and the cost in life and limb they're paying is humongous, no doubt about it. But the resolve is unshaken. The credit must be given to
Absolutely.
them. Yeah.
So
So
when
please.
when there's a soldier's funeral in Kiev or in any other town, there's a procession and they play this song. It's called Plina Kasha, and it's haunting when you hear it. And all these cars drove by and they're flying the Ukrainian flags and the flags of the regiment that the soldier served in, and people stop in the streets and they take a knee, and people driving by, they stop their cars, they get out and they take a knee. And this is what we've seen over the past 3 years, is the forging of Ukrainian identity as a state, which it, over years of occupation, centuries of occupation, um, had been chipped away until people had forgotten. I mean, there's a Ukrainian national dress, a Vyshyvanka. It's an embroidered shirt. Um, they were banned from wearing them during Soviet times and during some periods before. And now there's a national holiday. Everybody wears them on that day. And there's this, and Russia will not take all of Ukraine. It cannot be done with the resources that Russia has.
All right. We understand that too. But coming back to the brass tacks and about the great power rivalry, talking about the human condition over here, I couldn't help but overhear uh, the European commissioner, the European Union commissioner, saying talking about the children held hostage or kept in prison by the Russians. Why did they, take arrested the children, the Ukrainian children, and why are the Ukrainian children being held in Russian prisons?
So this is the reason why Vladimir Putin is a wanted criminal under the International Criminal Court. Upwards of 20,000 Ukrainian children were abducted by the Russians during their initial advance into Ukraine.
What were their ages? What were their ages?
Toddlers to teenagers.
Why would you do that? Why would you do that?
To erase their Ukrainian identity. And this is part of the war. Vladimir Putin does not see Ukraine as a real country. He doesn't see the Ukrainian language as a real language, the Ukrainian culture as a real culture. And this is something that Russia, throughout its imperial history, has done. They take people from one land, especially the big example people always think of as the Crimean Tatars, a Turkic Islamic population that were living in Crimea for centuries. And under Stalin, they were oppressed and deported to Siberia. Very few returned. Many died. And those who did return still lived under amount of oppression in the USSR, voted overwhelmingly for freedom from the USSR, for independence as a part of Ukraine, and now the same things are happening again. And then what they do, they take the indigenous population out, they move them somewhere else in Russia, because Russia's enormous, they can do that, and they bring in ethnic Russians, or a different ethnicity that they wanted to move from somewhere else. And it uproots a national identity, it uproots culture, it uproots history, and makes it much easier to say, okay, well, you speak Nenet, a language, or you speak Ukrainian. Well, you're not allowed to do that anymore, but you're living in Siberia, nobody speaks it anyway. So the kids all learn Russian. And it's been going on for centuries, this slow erosion of the many nations and the many identities in Russia, of their culture.
Like the Georgians, for example, they have maintained their identity, but they're also under attack?
Yeah, well, the Georgians are certainly under attack by Russia. They're an independent state, invaded by the Russians in 2008, when it looked like that they were going to try to move closer to the EU and try to join NATO. And the Russians invaded two regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And now there's this party in power which is increasingly repressive, a party called Georgian Dream. And they stole elections in December 24. All of the monitors say that this election was fraudulent. For example, I spoke to a Georgian politician, Marika Mikiashvili, give me an example of, you have to vote with your ID card, right? So Georgians, they knew were living outside of Georgia. They copied their ID card, and then they voted inside Georgia for Georgian Dream. And when they went to vote at the embassy in whichever country they were living at, they were told, oh, you've already voted. So they couldn't vote.
Yeah, well, I can relate, actually, because that's what happened in my country, Pakistan. That's how elections are stolen by my own institution, a former institution, Pakistan Army. That's how the recent regime is in power. So moving this entire debate a bit, because since we're talking about the great power rivalry, moving the stage from Europe to Asia, and in
Yeah.
Asia, the pivot is in Central Asia, where the future resources lies. And once you talk about Central Asia, the gateway to Central Asia is Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? Now, there is a great power rivalry at play over there where the Pakistani military wants to draw in the US, like, in the Cold War. Europe might be hungover because of the Cold War victory, but the Cold War was actually fought on ground that it was decided in Afghanistan,
Afghanistan.
right? And it was an operation between CIA and the ISI and the Mujahideen, who were turned into villains after the Cold War was won, and then later on, now they're back in power in Afghanistan, and the Pakistani military wants to do a regime change over there because that became a weight norm for the US-led forces. We all know about it. We,
Mhm.
the Britain, don't want to deal with Afghanistan because of the same reason, because we are averse to the idea of directly interacting with them because of what happened in Helmand. Whereas, well, they were defending their country. You were there as part of the international coalition, spreading democracy. Wow, where is that democracy? Is there any democracy in Pakistan? Because since your platform is dictators, we Democrats. So that's why I brought this in. How do you see, finally, how important is democracy as a tool of the European? Democracy is a product of uh, Europe, in fact, European model of democracy, the Westminster, UK in particular, the UK's Westminster model of democracy is so far not perfect, but by far the best form of government there is in the current world. Definitely far better than the dictatorship, right? So,
Yeah.
how important is democracy as a tool of foreign policy to spread the soft power of countries like United Kingdom, the Britain itself, and Europe, right? How important is democracy? And do you see democracy in real terms in South Asia? I mean, there is democracy in India, but then there is a majoritarian
Yeah.
democracy. Yeah. So the
There's
problem,
a
the
democracy in
majoritarian
India
democracy got
that's
their own problems. So I want to bring you to Pakistan because that is you can see the British the Union Jack with the Pakistani flag. So my audience, I've got a lot of audience. Mostly they're Pakistanis as well. The Pakistani diaspora, because we are speaking the English language. So that's Pakistani diaspora, and Pakistan's official language is also English. So they are also very much interested to hear you out, to hear out the typical British perspective. That if democracy, I know you'll say that democracy is important for the soft power because you support democracy. So
yeah.
how come the United Kingdom and the Europeans, the EU, is not supporting democracy in Pakistan then? Because we've got a regime right now which has been enforced upon the Pakistanis. They voted for Imran Khan, who's been thrown into jail. The European Union's the independent election observers were there. The European Union have not issued a detailed report of their election observation
There's
mission
no noticeable say.
because it
Yeah.
implicated the Pakistani military. And is it because? And then again, Ukraine wars comes in that it is the Pakistani military has got an influence that leverages that they're providing ammunition to Ukraine war. So how do you see that playing out? And if there is a peace deal in Ukraine, do you think the Pakistani military will still have that kind of influence? And how important is it for the United Kingdom and for Britain and the European Union to support democracy in countries like Pakistan and to then project the soft power? Theo?
So I'm glad you identified soft power as the main advantage of democracy. Democracies begin to fail when they engage in expansionist hard power adventures, as we saw in Afghanistan and as we saw in Iraq. And they are mistakes. That's not to say democracy should never go to war. Democracy absolutely should when needed, and democracy needs teeth to defend itself and defend the ideals. And that's what I want to touch on here. I think a mistake is being made, and a mistake was made because of the victory in the Cold War and the peace dividends, all this stuff. Europe didn't have the arms. When war came knocking again, Europe was unprepared. And really, it should have been. The alarm went off a couple of times. I mean, in Georgia and South Ossetia in 2008, and in Ukraine in 2014, we should have realized, hey, hang on a minute. Um, this whole peace thing might not last, and should have done things about it. But it was politically inconvenient. People didn't want to do it because if you spend money on a shell, well, then you don't get that back. But if you spend money on a hospital or a school, then you get it back. So, fair. However, I think it is a short-term thinking. We need weapons, we need arms that the Pakistanis are making, and they won't sell to us if we come at them about the stolen election, about the dictatorship, about the military deep state, about all of the horrible torture and abuse that happens at the hands of the ISI, or the conduct that took place during our mistaken adventure in Afghanistan between NATO forces and the ISI on occasion. And they are being quiet about it because they recognize that they have failed to adequately prepare. And they need the Pakistanis, and they need the Indians, and they need the South Koreans, and they need everybody who is making something that goes bang to sell it to Europe so that it can be given to Ukraine. And I think it is an example of hypocrisy. But I can understand why it's happening.
Yeah, well, thank you for being candid over here and being candid and honest. Definitely one and the same thing. But thank you so very much for that, too. Because the Pakistani military weapons ammunition is required in Ukraine, that's why they've got that kind of leverage. But in a way, then this peace deal, so-called peace deal, between President Trump, the European leadership, and President Putin, if it goes through, and if there is a solution, I remember the previous program, in previous podcast, you said that you agreed that Ukraine will have to give up some land mass. That's what you believed, right? That's what you told me. Correct me if I'm... Yeah, de facto.
De facto, not de jure, and almost certainly not what the Russians are demanding at the moment.
Of course. But the middle ground has to be reached. But if there is peace in Ukraine, so does that mean that the Pakistani military will lose that advantage which they've got right now, the leverage which they've got right now? And don't you think that the same kind of ammunition could be produced in, let's say, Ukraine itself, which is being provided by Pakistan at the moment because of the vintage nature of it?
Yeah, I think it will reduce the leverage, and that is what the Europeans are doing. Rheinmetall, the big German weapons manufacturer, is building factories in Ukraine as well as Germany at the moment at quite an astonishing rate, because the general consensus is, oops, in Europe. We messed up. And so they are being humiliated. They're taking it on the chin at the moment, but there's a recognition that this can never happen again. So when Europe gets its weapons industries going, and bear in mind, the whole international world order is built to make sure that Europe doesn't get its weapons industries going again.
Yeah.
In the wake of World War II, because when Europe gets in a scrap, the whole world feels it.
I would second you, because the Pakistanis are producing this ammunition on German machinery. Germans have provided those factories. They've made the factory in Pakistan. All these factories, all these weapons are being produced on German machinery, German factories, which has been set up in Pakistan for the Pakistani military. All this vintage ammunition, these are all Hackler and Koch German factories. They're there, and now they're producing it. There is a realization in Europe that you rightly put it up. Oops. Oh yeah. So now they know. So hopefully what in that context, finally, what is the future of NATO?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. NATO is the big shield of Europe. A little bit battered at the moment, um, but I think that certain figures, especially Mark Rutte, the head of NATO at the moment, have played things very well. So I think NATO is and has recently added two new members in Finland and Sweden, which, next to Russia, they didn't complain too much about that one, despite the fact that the Finnish border is, I think, under 200 kilometers from St. Petersburg. Um, so the future of NATO will probably continue, but I think it should evolve. And NATO will probably continue as it is. I don't think that Ukraine will join NATO anytime soon. I think a separate security guarantee will have to be in place because the Russians have become emotive about NATO. And NATO doesn't pose a threat to Russia itself. NATO's never going to invade Russia unless invaded first. And that's the kicker. Any country that becomes a member of NATO is free from Russian boots on the ground.
Do you think NATO, as it stands, is a force capable enough without the major American support in itself? All right, it's North Atlantic, fine, but if you take the US support out of it, and if it is only the European Union militaries and the United Kingdom's military, do you think they're capable enough at as they stand right now to face Russia, for example?
The thing is, NATO is so integrated that asking that is like asking to take the eggs out of a cake once it's already baked. And it's integrated at every level, from headquarters to battalion command levels. There is NATO integration. So to do it separately, we would need a separate organization.
Well, but Theo, you needed a separate organization. You needed a separate organization in Afghanistan. NATO wasn't involved. The United Nations peacekeeping wasn't involved. International Security Assistance Force was made over there. So you've got the basic infrastructure available. It has to be a coalition of the willing, which has been made by the European nations, with Britain a part of it. So the coalition of the willing
it might be the coalition of the doing.
Are they willing to enhance their defense capabilities? That's the question.
Well, they've already committed to 5%, and that's not just to NATO, that's their defense capabilities. And it's 3.5% on the heavy metal, guns, things that go bang, and 1.5% on critical infrastructure and other things. So things you need to support a military. Good railways, roads, airports, all of that sort of stuff. So I think, yes, they are. They are absolutely growing their military capacity. And I think that there is a growing acceptance that Europe needs a unified defense policy, a European defense force. And that can be integrated. And could that beat Russia? Absolutely, could beat the snot out of them. The technological difference is so stark that European F-35 jets, as we saw when Israel, in the 12-day war, when Israel attacked Iran, Iran's top-of-the-range Russian air defense systems couldn't touch them. They were flying in broad daylight over Tehran. And those same jets are in many European countries. The Russians couldn't touch them. Not to mention the GDP difference.
Yeah, GDP difference is there. And not to mention democracy and the soft power and the freedom. Why we call it the free world? Because the freedom, if you've got freedom, you've got people willing to live and work for your country and voluntarily defend your country as well. So yeah, that's there. But having talked about war, we do know, and I'm sure you agree, that peace is the logical way forward, right?
Hmm.
So, what is the future for peace in Eurasia?
Oof. For the future for peace in Eurasia. Well, once the Ukraine war comes to an end, the security guarantees are going to need to be firm enough. And when I say firm, I mean British, French, German soldiers in Ukraine a few kilometers from any DMZ. That's the best guarantee. The best guarantee is NATO member state, not necessarily a NATO alliance, soldiers there. And the Russians say they will reject it. Well, they reject away. You don't have the capacity to stop it. As soon as a ceasefire is called, you could have those soldiers there, set up the camps within 24 hours, and then the Russians can do nothing. Call their bluff. They won't. They will not raise. So, as for the rest of Eurasia, we are seeing this combat between the great powers. And Europe is slowly realizing it has to be one again. The United States is desperately been trying to do it for the last 2 decades, trying to pivot towards China and Asia. And it wants Europe to deal with Russia, right? Fine. Europe has the capacity to do that. Give them 10 years, they'll be able to do it. Peace? I remember a book called The Devil's Dictionary. It describes peace, noun, a period of cheating between two periods of fighting. Peace can be achieved only if people stop
You're ready
being
to fight.
hypocrites. Yeah. You have to stop being hypocrites and you have to be ready to fight.
All right. That's fair enough. That's fair enough. But an eye for an eye will leave the whole world blind, Theo. Isn't that true?
Yeah, but we're not talking about revenge. Europe isn't. Ukrainians will talk about revenge, but the Ukrainian ceasefire demands are not demands for vengeance. They're demands for justice. And they are two very different things.
Finally, just off the topic, Theo, once you watch all these movies which are giving you the doomsday scenario, and it tells you, well, decades ago, or not decades ago, years ago, or centuries ago, maybe the world faced the biggest war, which is going to be a nuclear Armageddon we're talking about, and nothing is left. And now what's left in the world are all rubble and destruction, and nuclear proliferation, and all that scenarios. They're very scary, these movies, and you can see different kind of creatures. And well, don't you think that under the circumstances, the wars which we are witnessing right now, they've got the potential to become a nuclear war, because these are nuclear armed countries, and the
Yeah.
Russians just 2 days ago threatened a nuclear attack on Ukraine after it was suggested in a news leak by Financial Times that President Trump wants President Zelensky to hit Moscow, right? So they came back with their own, in Russian language, they came back with their own propaganda, and they threatened a nuclear attack. So there are madmen out there, like psychotic leaders. The Pakistani military chief, Asim Munir, just gave a statement in United States, in Tampa, Florida, at the Grand Hyatt, and he said, well, I'm going to take half of the world down with me because I've got nuclear weapons. If somebody challenges me, I'll take down the half of the world with me. You've got such madmen with such immense nuclear power, powerful arsenals like the nuclear weapons, and they're not stable. So if you've got this kind of leadership, they're dictators like Putin, like Asim Munir in Pakistan. They're dictators. They don't need approval to push the nuclear buttons. So doesn't it create a scary scenario? And watching these movies, don't you think there is a real chance that these predictions or prophecies would come true? The movies they're making, they do make a lot of sense like that. Do you think, or do you think the reason will prevail? What is your point
I
of view
think
of that?
think self-interest will prevail. You don't become a dictator to glass your country. Any nuclear power that were to use nuclear weapons would soon find them used on them, and that's why they are both essential if you're a small country trying to not be invaded, but also extremely difficult to use because what they are is a tabula rasa. You clear the slate, everybody's dead, and maybe the fish will evolve and become the next dominant species. Who knows? But
Or the octopus, or the
yeah,
octopus.
or them. Yeah, there's a very good book about that. But
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
very difficult to use, and Putin, that you can't enjoy your golden toilet, your many mistresses, your your expensive bottles of you know French wine and brandy if you are dead, which
yeah,
is why Putin is not going to push the nuclear button over Ukraine because he'd rather lose in Ukraine than lose everything.
yeah,
And the same applies. It's very difficult to use nuclear weapons in a limited war because at that point you escalate to the state of annihilation. And nuclear weapons are a curse, but they're a curse which comes with the boon that had there not been nuclear weapons during the Cold War, we would have seen a fairly quick repetition of the industrial bloodbath of World War II. And we didn't. We saw other bloodbaths all over the world, but we didn't see. We did in the Seven Nations War, but we didn't see a war openly between the United States and the USSR. We did see Americans killing Soviets and Soviets killing Americans. We saw Soviet jets flying over Korea. We saw Soviet manned air defense shooting down B-52s in Vietnam. We saw American CIA in Afghanistan arming the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles. And yet the two nations never came to direct battalion v battalion blows. And I
yeah,
predict that even if that were to happen in a proxy conflict that to some extent Ukraine is, it wouldn't escalate to nuclear war. Drop parachutists on Moscow, then yeah, maybe,
Hmm.
but not
So,
police.
yeah, going by that theory, strategic deterrence does work. And
Yeah.
it has worked ever since the Second World War. The strategic deterrence has played a pivotal role. Till the time you've got a nuclear button in the hand of a madman or some non-state actors, till that time, I'm sure the strategic deterrence and the nuclear deterrence would play its part. And we are hopeful for a bright future in this
Not too
way.
bright.
Not too bright under the current circumstances, obviously. But final word, Theo, on the great power rivalry between Russia, China, and the United States. Who's winning?
Oh, who's winning? Um, at the moment, probably the Chinese. They've managed to profit enormously off of the Ukraine, off the war in Ukraine. Um, Growth is beginning to sort of restart, and they are filling the void of American isolationist retreat, which will probably be reversed in 3 years' time. But that's a thing that the Americans need to get over themselves. So yeah, it's probably China at the moment. The Russian bear is beaten, bloody, and is very sickly, and I don't know how long that might last in its current form. And the American eagle's gone a little bit doolally,
Yeah,
and is flying desperately, wanting to fly back to the nest and just make lots of money while he's still in power. So yeah, probably the Chinese. I think they have the short and medium term ideas. Now, they could make an enormous mistake, and that would be attempting to invade Taiwan. That would
yeah,
be a huge strategic blunder.
Well, I don't think they're going to do that, Theo. They don't believe in fighting themselves. They want to win without fighting. That's Confucius for you. That's the art of war for you.
Sun Tzu,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, the Chinese, once you talk to them, they say that we're willing to wait for another 200 years, but we're not going to give up on Taiwan. So if they're willing to wait for another, and they said it 50 years ago, so if they're going to wait for another 150 years or 200 years to win the way they want to win, I'm sure they're creating enabling circumstances for themselves. And as you rightly pointed out, that this new Cold War or the great power rivalry, right now the leading player is China, no doubt about that. We'll see how it pans out. Anyway, thank you so very much,
Thank you very much for having
Pierre
me.
Mullis, for being a part of this very interesting debate, controversial but very interesting debate. And we will continue it. See you very soon, Theo. Thank you so very much.
Ta-da.
Ta-ta, bye-bye.